Boom. Yeah. Okay. So I want to get right into it, basically, because there's so much to talk about, and we only have but so much time today, anyhow. So I
All
want to
right.
talk about addiction today, and it's exciting and scary to talk about because it can be a bit of a vulnerable thing to talk about addiction. But I think it's something that I wish more people actually talked about. So I'm hoping that us talking about it will help other people talk about it, and maybe this will give people tools about how to talk about it. And we're probably going to mess up a couple times, but that's okay. Everybody messes up. If you have any feedback, feel free to message us because we haven't really gotten that much messages or feedback from people. So that's another reason why I'm not too worried about it. But once again, I think it'd be a really fun topic to talk about. And I think it is something that really needs to be talked about when we're talking about transformations and people trying to change themselves and people trying to be better versions of themselves, because kind of like the elephant in the room a lot of times, and nobody wants to talk about it because when you talk about it, there's a lot of other baggage that comes with talking about it. So that's the stage. There you go. That's
All
the
right, that's the stage. So there's two things I want to put on the stage here at the beginning. Is one thing obviously is that we're going to pull a lot of this from you. So you have a good master's education, so you learned probably a lot about this stuff, and then we're also going to pull a lot from our experience. Now we are not professionals in addiction or anything like that. So obviously that's like a forewarning for all of our episodes. We are just guys talking about what we've experienced and what we've seen in life and what we've thought about. And number two, what you said about vulnerability and stuff, it's interesting, man, because when we first started chatting about like having a podcast, like maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, this was what we wanted to talk about like a lot more, and we've talked about it in ways that I think that we're going to start talking about soon, because we talk a lot about habits in a lot of our episodes. So we've danced around addiction a lot, and I'm excited to give this a try, and we might try a couple times, but I think I'm excited about this episode.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Because we talk about habits so much, and because a lot of my education is in habit and behavioral health and health behavior education, I think it's really useful to know when you're learning about a topic such as habits, what the extremes are at one end of the spectrum and at the other end of the spectrum. So, in terms of habit, having like good habits, for example, you're on the end of the spectrum that's more, you're more likely that you're in a routine, but that routine isn't negatively impacting the rest of your life and the quality of your life in broad terms. But you can go too far with the habit into an addiction, for example. And then the other end of that spectrum is like a malaise and a non routine and a chaotic lifestyle, which some people actually thrive in, for example, or that's the lifestyle that they want to live in, for example, as well. And you could possibly, I bet you some people would argue, even the addictive phase might be actually something that one person sees as negative and another person sees as positive.
Now, is there a
So,
bridge, like when you're going from good habits to bad habits to addiction? Now, is
mhm.
there like a bridge from a bad habit to addiction that you have to cross? Or if you're thinking about it on a scale, where on the scale would addiction, like, would it be on the
So this
same
is like
scale?
a, it's like a U-shaped curve a lot of
Okay.
times when you look at how the data gets represented. That's why at horseshoe paradox
Mhm.
is similar to this, where that's why at the ends of the horseshoe you get similar negative propensities, I guess. And then at the bottom of the horseshoe, at the dip there, you get like low negative outcome, but a good rate of repetition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I
I
think
feel
that
like I need
kind
a
of.
whiteboard. I feel like I need a whiteboard to, but like habits and good routine have a low risk, moderate reward, basically.
Okay. Okay.
Versus the other ends of the spectrum could be, they end up being almost high risk, high reward, basically on both ends of the spectrum.
And it could be a low reward, right? In terms of bad habits, or are you talking about like how your body would adapt to it? Because one
Oh,
thing
I
that I
just
was
mean in
really,
terms of perception. I just mean in
yeah,
terms of perception. Just that's a
Okay.
good thing to talk about too. So a lot of this is, I think of this in terms of the perception of the people in the habit or taking a drug, for example, or just not doing anything. I wouldn't say you'd see as many people not doing anything, even when you think someone's not doing anything. Most of the
Hmm.
time, they're doing something. It's just something that's less societally incentivized, I would say.
Right.
Yeah, but okay. I feel like I'm going into the weeds a little too much with that, though. I think what would help people the most is talking about things like food addictions, exercise addictions, and then maybe you could get into a little bit of drug addiction. Because honestly, if you drink coffee, I doubt you're drinking it in a moderate way.
Right.
When I, like my first assumption, but I think it's getting better with people. I think people are moderating their coffee intake more nowadays. So I think the trend is getting better. But I would say caffeine in coffee is a mild drug
Yeah, dude,
because
there's some interesting things. So, what I saw about coffee when I was reading about this over the past week, I saw a statement about coffee, and it was basically like they were talking that coffee was a mildly addictive.
Mhm.
And I think about my personal experience about different addictions, and so I'm going to go down this rabbit hole a little bit. And so with coffee, I feel addicted to coffee. So I don't like that word addicted, and I want to get into that a little bit. But so when I have coffee, I feel something after, right? And you feel that like mental want that you can't describe
Yeah.
to have a little bit more, right?
Yeah. So there, in
And I
addiction, this is a good time to point out there's physical addiction and there's psychological addiction, and they do interplay with each other. Some things are more physical and less mental, and some things are more mental and less physical.
right,
Coffee kind of hits both of those, honestly,
right,
because
right,
physically it downregulates your body's ability to feel tired, and mentally people do it usually consume it in a very ritualistic manner that tells their brain that you want this, and if you don't get it, you're going to be more tired very soon.
right. Because the statement it said, and like it said that coffee was not addictive, was not like was on the mild scale.
Hmm.
And when I think about addiction, I know that something like coffee, like I feel it, like I feel it a lot. And if you don't have it for a couple of days, it hurts your body, right? Because it's a physical dependence. I think that it has something to do with this social awareness of the masses that we are always talking about coffee. We're thinking about it. We're 100% aware of it all the time. So we know that it's bad for us and we drink it. But so when we want to drink a little bit less coffee, because everyone kind of gets like that feeling sometimes,
Yeah.
then because we're so aware, I think we have this mental ability to leap over the fact that it is physically addictive. Because okay, I've been addicted to a few things, and coffee, tobacco, and guess what, junk food, number three, that we haven't even talked about. Those three things can get I've experienced the same like withdrawal symptoms of like extreme withdrawal, like where like my heart is pumping and I like start sweating and stuff like that from those three things. And it leads me down to this thought process of that the more aware we are of our addictions, like basically just the easier it is to overcome.
Right.
And that's why I don't like using addictions. I like to just use them like as behavior.
Right.
But also I don't like to lightly say that because I know that there are people like who really follow that like term addiction, and I am an addict, and I'm fine with however you want to frame it around yourself. But like from me having that framework, I know I'm just talking here. Like from me having that framework when I was younger to now, I feel like I'm much freer when it comes to all of my behaviors. And I can see this like when it comes to exercise, food, drink, substance, or anything like that. That was just my little spiel. I want to get the mindset where I'm going and how I'm thinking about addiction or behavior, because I think changing that mindset is huge.
That made me think about a lot of things, honestly. So like I think that's really useful. So let's try and define addiction, and I don't think we're going to do a great job at it, but I think it's going to be useful to think of it this way. And really, it is a behavior. It's in the category of behavior. Okay. And then there's subcategory addiction. Okay. And then addiction really, to place that category on someone's behavior, it's one part external and one part internal. And what I mean by that is someone can consider themselves an addict and society can consider them an addict, okay? Or someone can consider themselves not an addict and society considers them an addict, okay? And then it depends on who you're talking to, okay? But generally speaking, you would assume that an addictive behavior has negative consequences for that person. Okay. That's really it. So you could say addiction is a behavioral pattern that produces negative consequences over the long term for somebody.
Okay,
Like that.
very true.
Okay. So then you have like a four. This is where you have to have a high school level of education, because once you start splitting things into not binary, but like even just four different dimensions, we have four different dimensions now about addiction. Okay. We have internal, external. Okay. And then we have like repeating a behavior, like for positive reason, with positive consequences, repeating a behavior with negative consequences. Okay. I'm already having a hard time saying this in words in a way that I think it'll translate. So a lot, and that's, I think, a big part of the problem, because people want to just put it in a good or bad category. Okay. And
And
there's a
then,
lot more nuance about addiction and about like behaviors that have negative repercussions, basically.
yeah, that's really true. It can always change. I like to sometimes think about it at experience points, right? So let's say you're 18 years old and you wake up, and let's say you are feeling good and your mind is a little crazy and you're open to change, right? And then you're at that part of your life, and so you wake up and say and this is how I think about it, like your addiction scale is at 60%, right?
Like
And
how
then
likely are you to get addicted to something? Is that your addiction scale?
yes, let's say how much of if you were to label someone an addict or not an addict, and you wake up and you're at 0%, right?
Okay.
And so then you go out throughout your day and something negative happens to you, and
Uh,
now you go from 0 to 5%, right?
right.
And then now you go to an environment that is now more open to maybe some kind of addictive behaviors or something like that. So now so say a bar, right? So now I go into a bar, and that's just for me. Everyone has different addictions, or that's just for this example. You go
Mhm.
into a bar, and then now you go from 10% to 30%.
Mhm.
Now you hang out with your best friends, right?
Mhm.
Like your boys, like your favorite friends. And now your addiction goes from 30% to 50%. Now your boys meet up with the girls.
Mhm.
And so now you go from 50% to 70% because all
Right.
these
And
things
that's that
are.
interplay. That's that interplay between the internal and the external.
So it's this weird. So I think addiction, I just think there's so much to it when it comes to the mental and your environment. Because I've thought about it just so much, like how you get caught up in these addictions, and how I've always felt about them when I look back is that I never am addicted tomorrow. It's just like
Mhm.
over time these things happen.
Right. And that's why I think it's really useful to think about it like a behavioral pattern. Okay. But it's one of
Yeah.
the harder behavioral patterns to to change, basically. And it's not always, for example, coffee. It's not like I'm trying to tell people or myself to stop drinking coffee. I'm not trying to be abstinent a lot of times with a behavior pattern that can be addictive. You know,
Right.
almost you're almost at more risk. And people have stories about other behavior patterns that if they're too abstinent with, they're going to go in the opposite direction. basically, eventually, or they're going to get exposed to that opposite direction, and they're not going to be inoculated at all in any way to behave in a way that is just binary, like yes or no, and they're just going to choose yes eventually.
Like
You
cutting
need
off cold turkey.
so that's the point. Like, you need nuance in this conversation, okay, to actually get to empower yourself to make the decisions and to change your behavior, and not just no or yes with these things. Because if you go no or yes, and you're going to be in an external environment that is influential, then you're not going to be prepared. You're just not.
Okay. Now, we talked about this on a previous episode. At that very beginning part of your choice, though, you need to make a clear conscientious choice, right? If you like, so I know you want to say like no or yes, right? There's that black or white. And I know we don't want to live on that scale. But do you need to say at some point, like, I choose to not be yes or no, I choose to not be black and white, but I need to choose? Well, as soon as you go from that to being on a scale, it's like you're on two different things. So it's like you almost have to make that first choice yes, all right, to get to hop onto that scale. And then once you're on that scale, then
And
now it's like a new life. Now it's like you live this new life of, wait, I'm in control of this scale. I understand my scale. I can see when I'm more likely to maybe fall into these bad habits, and then choose or create an environment that will help you in the future and help you grow.
I think you need an actual mode of operation, like a modus operandi. I think you need you need to be in a mode of operation that when decisions get passed through your mind, you have a template, is a usually successful template. And I think it's harder for people who don't get that template, or get the wrong template, like people who grew up in families with addiction, for example, or people who are never exposed to addiction and then they move into an environment that has a lot of addictive behavioral patterns.
And all those have subtleties too, right? Because there's that old saying where there's there's a father who has two sons, and then the father is an alcoholic, and one son grows up and watches his dad the whole time and decides that he will never drink a day in his life, and then the other son will become the same thing. And it's just funny how this addiction kind of changes in every single person, even being in the same environment, because environment's only a part of the whole puzzle.
I think that's natural. What you just said there, though, that story, I think that's just a story about the natural occurrence of how that whole horseshoe paradox works, basically. So, like, you could see this in political parties nowadays. Okay, go to one extreme of a political party and go to the other extreme of a political party, and then look at how tyrannical they are in enforcing their beliefs. Right? Very similar, basically. Okay. Once, like, when you get to both ends of the spectrum, when it comes to behaviors, like extreme behaviors, basically, you're gonna have people who copy what you do because it rewards them in some way.
Right.
They have a square hole for that square peg, and it just bam, square peg, square hole, perfect. Okay, and other people are going to, depending on how sustainable that behavior is. If it kills like the first generation, it's not gonna last very long. But if it keeps people alive and it hits enough holes, it'll last long enough. But if it's starting to break down, or if there's cracks in the armor, so to speak, then you're gonna see people who all they have to do is do the opposite. Just do the opposite, and they might actually get some of their needs fulfilled just by doing the opposite. Basically, that's how, like, a lot of things for me with being overweight were, basically, where I didn't have any skinny people around me at all.
Oh,
And
yeah.
like, when I say, I mean like regular weight people, like a
Right.
lot of times around me, and like hung out with heavy friends, hung out with heavy family, hung out. And there's a certain point where if I just do the opposite, I get results. but you also
Right.
you have to want to do that too. So there has to, and that want has to come from a need not being fulfilled a lot of times.
Yeah, that's interesting. So should we talk about the food, like food and weight and stuff like that a little bit? And then
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
what kind of needs do you need to fulfill for that? What do
There's
you mean?
four big needs in human beings. You know about the four big needs? Have we talked about the four big needs on the podcast?
I think we did it in our our last pod, the need ath. Why don't you enlighten us today, Mike?
Okay. Okay. Some people call them the four F's.
Okay.
Okay, so they're fight. These are the motivations for our actions at a primal level. Okay, there's fight, there's flight, there's feed, and there's fornicate.
I was wondering where you were going with that one.
Yeah, I like to give a little extra pause on that last one. But the last one actually you want to think of deep relationships more so, I would say.
Yeah.
But those deep relationships in a social animal equate to fornicate because that's what makes a species. This is what makes a species survive. These are survival
Right.
needs. And not like Maslow's hierarchy, more if this doesn't happen, the species doesn't survive. Like
Right.
evolutionary
Right. That
needs.
it's like a primal drive for all animals.
It just it has to happen or your species doesn't survive. Okay.
Right.
All right. So that's deep in our processing, basically. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's needs that if those aren't met, the processing starts to get a little wonky. Okay. And sometimes it's all right. Like you drive your car and the windshield wipers don't always work. Or whatever. It could be a little thing like that. You may not even notice it. It might be like the sunroof doesn't work, but you never use the sunroof. So who cares?
Yeah.
Stuff like that. It could be that. Okay. So for some people, it doesn't matter. But when it comes to addictive behaviors, I think it's really useful to know that when it comes to food, for example, that's one of those ones that like is deep in your physical, neurological psyche. That's where the hairs cross, basically.
Right. Yeah. You have to eat.
Okay. And the broader part of that whole feed is it's not just calories in your mouth. It's put calories and nutrients in your mouth, and minerals and the things that make your body able to do the things it needs to do. And some people are sitting all day and they have a kid and nature nature continues basically, but then they die early of metabolic disease. And so we're getting to the state where we're starting to have, I think, multi-generational issues, honestly. But that's a whole other thing, basically.
Yes.
And if you
But
just
it's part of it. But it's part of it, though, right? It like it can definitely influence your environmental habits from an early age if it's passed down from generation to generation.
Oh,
I mean, it's all related.
Yeah. So my whole point in that is that when you're trying to affect your food behaviors or your food addictions, or your food behaviors that have negative consequences, right? You got to understand is that it's going to be a lifelong thing, basically. It's going to be a lifelong thing. And these things that are more close to those root needs, it's for life, basically. You're going to have to have a system for it, or it's going to you're going to be to walk whatever line society has written for you, basically.
Are we talking about candy here? Because that's like my first thought.
I was thinking of a food example. Okay, so candy. Candy's good. So candy is a little bit externally looked down upon societally, but not a lot. Like we have Halloween and all that kind of stuff.
It's looked down upon in the 20%. It's looked up upon in the 80%, I feel. Everyone eats candy every day.
Yeah, but I see people eat candy and like I know one part of them is thinking, do I really need to eat this candy? Most people have that little like their actions speak louder than their words because their actions say otherwise. But I know in the back of their head.
Candy's so big, like I was talking about coffee earlier, like it's just so there in society that everyone knows that candy, you shouldn't be eating a bunch of candy.
Right. Now, that's the thing though, but a bunch, right? So we don't need to have a bunch of candy, But what is a bunch? It's all on a time scale, right? Like if I have a bunch of candy one time in my life, is that a big deal?
To me,
No.
maybe, probably not.
But for the most part, no. So it's all about how many times are we doing it? Like you got to do the math, basically. And until you do the math, you're not really going to be aware of it. But
Right.
you don't have to do the math that often. Kind of got to, I don't know. Most people change every 5 years with a lot of their behavior. Every 5 years,
Yeah.
basically.
Well, but if you're in a change cycle, like if you're in if you follow along with us and you do some of the things that we do, then you would know that all the year we're planning our food. Like, so we've set systems up to, because at early ages, we realize that food is both, at least for me, one of my favorite things to do in the world, because obviously it's the top 4 F's of motivation, but it's also such an important, like I will overeat. I tend to overeat and have a lot of these tendencies, and I have to think about all these things all the time. And
But it gets deep. It's okay. So we could get deep with it too. For example,
sure.
like why is that motivation not being met? Why do you feel what's not being met? And why is it going off into the so say let's assume somebody's having too much candy, right?
Yeah.
Too much candy too often. Basically. A high amount and a high frequency.
Yes.
So what need is not being met, basically? And I actually had a client recently. This is rare, okay? So think that you can do this and all of a sudden it's going to work, okay? But every once in a while you can throw like a tool at someone and it's the right tool, okay? Um, he was eating a bunch of junk food. It was mostly things like running the McDonald's or picking up stuff. Oh, that was fast food. And I found in the past that people with that kind of behavior and other patterns I had seen him get into with like chips and stuff like that, that he may not be getting like his sodium needs met at the right time, basically. And he likes to be active. And so there's all these other things. And it just made me think of that. So I was like, okay, this is an easy experiment to do. And he was open to it. And so he just started taking some iodized sea salt in water in the morning, like a quarter teaspoon in the morning, and his junk food cravings dramatically went down and he lost like 15 pounds in 3 months.
Right.
Now, he also started working out more as well, but he just forgot to eat the junk food when he would normally eat it because he wasn't getting that signal from his body. Because at the beginning of the day for him, and for most people, your cortisol spikes in the morning. And one of the things that cortisol spike, some of the nutrients that cortisol spike requires to get the organs to pump and to get the muscles to go and all that kind of stuff. And the results of that cortisol spike downstream on the nutrient requirements for your body is having adequate electrolytes. Okay? And if you don't have them early in the morning, you're basically in the tube early, and then you take coffee or something like that, and it tells you you're not tired. Forget about that. You don't have to think. You don't have to listen to that until these caffeine effects wear off. Okay, and
Right.
we got good half life today because you drank 20 ounces.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Okay, so what need isn't being met? There's a great psychologist that I love. His name is Gabor Mate, and this is how he addresses all addiction. And this is how he gets into really awkward conversations a lot on podcasts as well, basically. Because you start talking about addiction, and people I have met has talked to me about some kind of I either talked to me about some kind of addiction at some point, or I'm quite sure they had an addiction that just maybe they weren't talking about. Like everybody has experienced addiction at some point. A negative behavior pattern that breeds negative results that they wanted to stop but had a hard time.
And how many of those people is food involved with it?
In our current society, probably a bunch.
A lot.
Probably, like, maybe not all. Okay, so say there's 70% of the U.S. is overweight and obese. Okay, I would say not all overweight and obese people have a addictive behavior pattern with food. Okay,
Right.
but those other 30% of people could. as well. So it's
Right.
probably close to that 70%. It's at least 70%, I would say.
Okay, so we are talking on the side of that person not having like an addictive propensity, you said, right?
Right.
And now let's throw in something that you haven't even mentioned that I think is super important, and that is how food is being manufactured these days to elicit those responses that you're talking about. Because how you explained the body's response to not getting enough sodium in the morning and your cortisol spiking, I think those reactions are what our brain is telling us like that addiction is. Like that, like boom, that feeling that you have in the morning when you don't have that coffee or whatever, like it's like that's that signal. And go ahead.
Okay, so just take that analogy, okay? And okay, sometimes your body is not getting its hormonal needs met, right? Okay, like maybe you're not producing certain hormones for whatever reason. Maybe you're overproducing certain hormones. So maybe you're not getting, a lot of people aren't getting their social needs met. People who live the
Mm-hmm.
longest a lot of times have their social needs met. And our longevity scores are not looking good lately, basically. Um, so there's a lot of different categories of what needs are not being met. And then
Right.
there's a lot of different ways to meet those needs with replacements, basically. And I think a lot of this is actually the most successful strategy for dealing with addiction, I would say. And that's replacement.
Okay.
And I think the problem that people have is sometimes they'll replace things with replacements that aren't very good. And it's hard to know if it is going to be a good replacement until you try it, you
Right.
know? And maybe it's hard to be educated about it because maybe there's not a lot of really good literature about it because not a lot of people like to talk about it.
Right. Because there's a lot of money going into food and stuff like that right
Because
now.
there's a
And
lot of things that reinforce negative behavioral patterns in terms of our chronic or our long-term health right now. We have a lot of chronic diseases. We don't have a lot of acute diseases. So we've gotten good at the acute, the weird things that like kill people in one generation kind of thing.
right.
And we've gotten really good at that, but we haven't figured out like the multi-generational things yet. And that's why you start to see more and more chronic things pop up, basically.
I don't think that there'll ever be a solution to addiction or anything like that because that's what we're talking about today. There is no exact, like, you're addicted or not addicted. It can be in the sense of physical addiction, but even still, I would still say that that's on a scale. Like, maybe you are super addicted, like, you're what we're saying as super addicted, maybe you're 90% addicted to something. And then
Right.
if you completely stop doing that thing, you might have a 15% addiction or something like that to that same thing, even though you're not doing it at all. And so, like, those types of, I don't know, like, I know we're
Well,
talking about the same thing.
the physical addiction research, I would say, is trending in the direction of very much circumstantial on the mental status of the addictee.
Okay.
So
Yeah, that
if
would
the
make
mental
sense.
status of the addictee is in a stable place
Hmm.
and you work on the addictive pattern. Okay, say, have you ever heard of the Vietnam veterans that came back from the war that were hooked on opioids, supposedly?
Yes, I've heard a little bit about that.
Okay, so they go and they fight in a unpopular war and they get addicted to opioids when they're out there. I'm butchering this probably a little bit, but they go back home and the ones who go back to stable home environments, I want to say 5 times, maybe even 10 times, it's a drastic number, more likely to quit, like to just stop eventually with the opioids and not have that issue. And the ones who go back to a not stable environment continue to have an issue with the opioids. So I'm sure there's a physical part to it,
Right.
but that there's Dr. Do you know about Dr. Carl Hart?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I've seen a
So
couple interviews with him.
he's had some great interviews. He's got some great books out, and it's a lot of them are about how people talk about addiction and how people talk about drugs and whatnot.
Right.
And he's shown that a lot of these physical addictions can be people can get on drugs and get off drugs basically with a lot less of the physical issues that the current story has been telling us, I would say. You know, there's a lot of reefer madness basically going on with a lot of drugs, honestly,
Right.
nowadays. And it's not to downplay how those behaviors and drugs and when it's the behaviors and the environment make people's lives and how hard it is. And I'm not trying to downplay that at all. I'm just saying that when we look at this with less, I don't know, less dramatic viewpoint and just a what is this doing in these environments with these factors and how do we improve it, then there's a lot that we can do better when it comes to getting people off drugs and getting people off of addictive behaviors and improving like healthy behavior patterns.
Yeah, dude, I love it. I know there's a lot into it, and I've seen some interviews with him, and I believe it, and I think that negative stigma has a lot to do with it. Well, let's take something like easy, and let's take cannabis. I mean, how much did we hear when we were younger? Okay, first off, like in the 50s and 60s, or 30s or whatever, with reefer madness, yes, it's so addictive. But then, like when we were younger, you would hear that, oh, it's not physically addictive, but it's mentally addictive, right?
Right.
Like you hear things like that, and now that it's basically legalized almost everywhere, like the perception of it is so different. If you talk about it when you were 15, when you were 18 years old, and you're like hiding somewhere, like doing cannabis, and like it's like this thing, like it puts all these negative like things on it, and then people have these negative experiences with it. There's jail, there's all this stuff that what is revolved around it, and when it comes down to it, and that's not even going into the addiction part, right? And when you ask somebody who like, hey, if you go up to two people and one person is a non-cannabis smoker and one person is a cannabis smoker, you're almost always going to know. So what is the
You'll know if you're a cannabis smoker, but if you're not a cannabis smoker, you won't. I don't think.
oh, that's intriguing.
I think
Okay.
other cannabis smokers can find other cannabis. I think other whatever your taste in recreational drugs are, I think you can find other people more easily.
That's true. So what my point I was trying to get at
Sorry,
was that
sorry.
oh no, it's fine. No, because that's a good point. Perspective is everything, and oftentimes you don't see other people's perspectives. But what I was getting at is that people outside of cannabis see things so much differently. And so
Yeah.
with that guy, that Dr. Hart, I know he experiences things and he tries things. I trained a psychiatrist for 3 years, and we had so many cool conversations, right, about drugs and all that kind of stuff. And this person never drank alcohol, did tobacco, smoked
Like
cannabis,
old
or
school
any,
straight edge.
but a psychiatrist, and so knows everything about the chemicals of all these things and how it supposedly is going to react and whatnot. So they have such a different perspective on somebody who maybe has, I'm just saying as an example, done a line of coke or something like that. If you do that and then you feel what that feels like, to are you withdrawing from that, are you not withdrawing from that, if you go into it with the mindset of, hey, I'm not going to get addicted to it, but I know that my body is going to want to need something, then those are different mindsets than say like the doctor who has never done something like that and just knows what it's going to do to your body and knows the negative side effects, but doesn't know the true experience of coming out of withdrawal or going in, like becoming quote unquote addicted to something, I think those things have a big play in your future experiences with addiction. So if you do become addicted to something younger, then when you go and say another substance comes your way, or food, or we haven't even gotten into exercise and stuff, and I don't even think we're going to get into that today, but you notice these things that you're going to get on board with. And so does addiction become a completely physical thing, or does it become this just another part of life that you have to add tools to your life and structures to your life to get around these things? Because experience has such a big part, I think, to do with with addiction and just life in general.
Yeah. So the whole replacement as the best strategy, as the most successful strategy. It's not the only strategy. Like abstinence does work sometimes for some. I'm not saying it doesn't. It's just if I'm going to make a bet on who's going to do better with their behavior change, and I see people doing different things, and that one's doing replacement, then I'm going to guess them. And the reason I say that is because so you need good replacement strategies, okay? Which means you need access to good replacement strategies sometimes. This is why like access to healthcare is really useful and such a big topic for people, right? You need access to quality food. You need access to a quality workout environment. And some people just don't have the access, honestly. And you can be, but you can be, there are creative things out there. And that's one of the things with reasons why I think it's so useful to get internet out to people, honestly. It's so you can have access to being more creative with how you get your resources for things, right? You need that access, and then you also need to be in a mode of operation that is conducive to you getting in a good behavior. And that's multidimensional, right?
Yeah.
Like when I say those Vietnam veterans went back to a stable home environment, like I say that because that's the shortest way to explain what that environment looked like. But that's a lot of things, right? What's a stable home environment look like? That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
Basically.
Very true. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not something that needs to be taken lightly for sure. And I like the example of someone who's done something and been in that negative routine. For example, being a mentor, I really like that a lot. And I think we need more of that. Honestly, I think we got enough book people in the books. And so when you talk about the psychologists, I'm not saying it's not that they can't do a good job, okay? But if they want to be on the edge of the field working on the problems of today, okay? Like the new problems, the things that are up there in terms of the trends that we're having, right? They have to have experience. They have to have both. Both is not, I mean, to be really good in your field, you got to be well rounded. You can be really good with a specific part of the population, though, and never really have to be any better as well, though. You can have that. That's like the roof on the car, the sunroof on the car that he never opens.
Or you could be the personal trainer who just comes out of college like a ripped athlete and
exactly.
never experienced fat loss before in your life, and like you get a client who needs to lose 200 pounds and
are you eating so much? Just eat less. God.
Yeah. Listen, yeah, 100%. I get that, man. Yeah. Okay, man, we talked about a lot, and I don't know if we went anywhere with it, but I think we had some good nuggets. Do we?
Yeah.
Is there some important things that you want to like end with here? I know that we can have some more episodes on this, but like one or two things.
Yeah. So a lot of times I would assume people would listen to this podcast if they're trying to figure out a way to deal with a negative behavior pattern, right? And it's probably going to be something like exercise or nutrition or maybe sleep. For example, like getting in a better sleep routine or stress, for example, because that's a lot of time what personal trainers and coaches deal with. And I think it's really useful and the kind of things you can do to know the things you can do now, basically. But taking all that into context about what we talked about today, I would say the things you can do now is, let me get set up here, is you can look for good resources or gather good resources, okay, for those replacements, okay, and you can maybe even write down or just assess in some way what in your environment is reminding you to do those behavior patterns. And is there anything you can do to make that a little bit less remindery, basically? Because I think the environment's going to affect you more most of the time, honestly. And we're finding this more and more in behavioral research. It's like right now, either that or we just we weren't finding it, we weren't looking in the right places in the past, basically. But there's a lot of environmental cues that are happening with people nowadays that are just pushing you down that path. And if you can just a little like turn in that path, a little kink in that path, oh, you can get some big changes. And I think that's a really good place to start. So start there.
Start with the environments, and that's what I was going to say too. My biggest thing, I think, for addiction, or my biggest lesson for everybody, or that I've learned, is setting up your systems, which is the environmental thing a little bit that you're talking about. And for me, some of my biggest things are bad food. If you know that you want to eat some candy, then cool, make that happen. But don't go to the store and buy a bag of 50 pieces of candy. Go to the store, buy buy that piece of candy that you're going to eat for that day or for that meal, and that's the only thing you buy, and you go back home and you eat it. And you just make little rules like that. Quote unquote systems is what I call them, is that you just don't
systems
go to
for your environment. Systems for your
system.
environment.
Yep, systems
Because
for your environment.
because some people, for example, might have to add an extra step to that system, which would be like, don't go to the grocery store hungry, right? Or else I'm
Yeah,
always going to get that giant bag.
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Right? But you don't know until you try that first thing, maybe.
So that's a good point, is that like as soon as you set up your system, you'll probably have to iterate that system a few times. Actually, probably for the rest of your life. That's why we have this podcast called Fit Quest, because we're always have to change just a little bit. And I think changing these systems and being aware of your systems and first being aware of these potential addictions are all the most important thing for you to start down this path to change from that perspective of addiction being I'm addicted or I'm not addicted, to being, oh, today I'm less likely to become addicted and tomorrow I might be more likely to become addictive, and I just need to set my systems up to give me the best shot.
Yes, agreed. That's why we're called Vivo training systems as well.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, that's what I figured.
Little plug there. All right, you guys, thank you for listening. Hope that made some kind of sense.
All right, thanks guys. Good talking to you, Mike.
Cheers.